Hey class, today we're going to be talking about ethical relativism. In my lecture earlier in the week, we talked about the four different ways we might view the nature of morality, relative to the individual, relative to groups, which is ethical relativism, soft universalism, and then hard universalism. Today we're going to be talking about ethical relativism and soft universalism and a little bit more depth. Some of the strengths and weaknesses of each, some of the questions that might be raised for each. So hopefully this will bring it into clear focus. Quickly, the difference between ethical relativism and cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is just a descriptive theory. It's just if you go around the world and you run into different cultural groups, you realize they have different moral systems. It doesn't say whether that's good or bad, right or wrong. It does not make a moral judgment or justification. It's just descriptive. Ethical relativism says different groups have different moral frameworks or theories, and that's a good thing, right? We should embrace that, be tolerant of that. And so, in some sense, ethical relativists say there are no moral universals, and morality should be determined by groups, religions, and cultures. It's a normative claim saying how things ought to be or how things should be. It's not just descriptive. Sorry about that. Ruth Benedict, she was a cultural anthropologist that you read about. And basically, cultural anthropologists go from place to place, and they study various groups, right? Sometimes they dedicate their whole life just to studying one group, maybe Aboriginal groups, those that live in rainforests or other parts of the world, right? And maybe it's exploring or cultivating, excavating certain sites to get a sense for culture back in various historical time periods. And so she was a person who went to various groups and places and really spent time studying them, just listening, viewing, taking a passive role. And again, this is in the 1930s and 40s when you still had groups that were isolated in many respects, and so they were very different, often from Western cultures, from industrialized cultures. And so she spent a lot of time doing that. She makes the claim that wherever you go, it seems that morality is defined by what is normal. Whatever's normal for a particular society, that's what they call good. And those who go against the norm are considered wrong or immoral, right? And she begins to think that this is all morality is. So she actually transitions from cultural relativism, where she's just describing groups, to ethical relativism, where she says, I think that morality really is nothing more than what groups perceive to be normal within the norm. And therefore, we should not judge other cultures, but be tolerant of them. So she eventually becomes an ethical relativist. She gives lots of examples. A couple from the reading. She talks about the island of Melanesia, where the particular group operates based on paranoia. You never let someone near your cooking pot because you're scared they might poison you. In this group, you don't share how your crops went for a particular year because if you have a really good crop, the assumption is that you must have used black magic to steal crops from your neighbors, right? So you wouldn't want people to know if you had a good or bad crop. Those that are overly trusting are considered foolish or naive. They're sort of mocked. Because the idea is our neighbors are sort of out to get us. Black magic is very real, and so there's a sense of dishonesty and paranoia that permeates this particular culture. And Ruth Benedict's point is they define morality by what's normal for them, right? And it's very different from ours. Their virtues and whatnot are very different. And how can we judge them, right? If we grew up in that culture, we would be just like them. We would have the same beliefs that they have. Nothing gives us an outside perspective. We inherited a particular morality. We were born in a particular time period, a particular culture, country, religious tradition, and that's the morality we think is right. But how do we know, right? If we were born in Japan, we'd probably be Buddhist. If we were born in other countries, we'd probably be Hindu and have a totally different moral framework. And so there's no way to get outside of our own perspective and see things objectively, clearly, or universally. So the only alternative is to be some kind of a relativist, and she says it's best to be a group relativist, right? She gives another example of some Indian tribes in the Pacific Northwest where when death would enter the tribe, like she tells the story of a chief whose wife and I think one of his children were drowned in a river. He did not blame anyone for this, but the idea is that if you have the power to confront death and to do something about it, then you should do that. And so he gathered up some of his hunters and went to another tribe who he knew was not responsible and killed several of their men, showing that death did not get the last word, that he was strong enough to confront death in these ways. And this is what was expected of the chief and of anyone else who can respond to tragedy with strength. She says this would be murder to most of us, but it's not to them. It's a very different cultural or ethical framework. And so, again, how do we judge them? If we lived in their shoes, we'd think like them. And there's no way we can know outside of our own eyes, outside of our own perspective, what morality is really like. It's ultimately constructed by various groups, right? So a few comments about ethical relativism here, right? If what is good gets defined by what is normal for a given group or culture or religion, then morality cannot help but be relative. Benedict makes the transition from cultural relativism to ethical relativism when she argues that the good can be and should be defined by what is normal. In fact, it's the only way it can be defined, right? According to her, ethical relativism argues that there are no moral universals. Every culture, religious group, etc. must develop their own set of moral standards. Typically, ethical relativists believe that morality is a human construction. Now, it's possible that a person could be an ethical relativist and believe in God, or that morality originates from God. But you might, in other words, a person might say, I believe morality is objective, that God has certain fundamental moral principles or virtues, rules that every human should follow. They're universal. But because we're human and our knowledge is limited, we don't know what those virtues, principles, or rules are, right? We do the best we can to decipher what God wants and what God's calling us to, but because we're sinful and limited in our knowledge, we can't know for sure, and so morality becomes somewhat relative, not because the nature of morality is relative, but because human knowledge is limited. That's a smaller group. Most ethical relativists argue that morality is primarily or entirely a human construction, right? Now, it's important that you recognize that this ethical relativism is not anything goes relativism. It doesn't mean you get to create morality for yourself. We're talking about large groups that create morality, like Christianity. That's a big group. You don't create it for yourself. Once you say you're Christian, certain moral principles apply to you, right? And you have to submit to. Or if I live in the United States and I embody a moral framework based on the laws and the Constitution, well, that's a moral framework. It can help us resolve problems. If we have a conflict and we're both members of the United States, we have laws that help us resolve moral difficulty or moral disagreement. So don't get that confused, right? And there are some positives with ethical relativism. It has problem-solving ability, like I mentioned. If two Christians disagree, we can look to Scripture, Christian tradition, our pastor to help us resolve it, because there's a standard set of morality for Christians, at least a core that we agree to. Same thing with the United States or any other religious group. So ethical relativism can solve disagreements. Ethical relativism promotes tolerance. Because other groups are different from us, we shouldn't judge them. If we live in that culture, we think just like them. So we should not interfere. And we should live and let live. And in some ways that can be a positive. We don't pass judgment on other groups. We can make judgments within our own group. If you say you're Christian, I can now judge you according to Christian principles. But if you're not Christian, I can't do that anymore. And I have to be tolerant of you and your moral view and your culture because it's different from mine, right? 3, it helps explain cultural differences that we find in morality. So if we adopt this view, we can say, oh, this is why we have so much moral difference in the world. This is why so many different codes, laws, and whatnot. And that can be very helpful. Now, as opposing this view is a man named James Rachels and others, right, that say we have some issues with ethical relativism. Rachels, in fact, is a soft universalist, right? So he lays out the argument for ethical relativism here. Premise one, different cultures have different moral codes. That is not disputed. That's just a descriptive fact. Premise 2, there is no objective way to determine which moral codes are true and which moral codes are false. Therefore, there is no objective moral truth. Rachels suggests that this argument has some weaknesses and that it leads to some problems. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Some of his criticisms of ethical relativism, and others make these criticisms as well. Ethical relativism does not allow us to praise or condemn the behavior of outgroups. So I can't criticize Hutus when they start killing Tutsis in Rwanda, they start committing genocide. I can't criticize them because I'm not a Hutu and I don't have their moral framework. So I have to sit back and say, well, that's just Hutu morality. They hate Tutsis and that's okay for them. It's not okay for us in the United States, but it's okay for them. Something like that. But don't we want to say that what they're doing is wrong? That genocide violates certain universals? Rachel says, yes, it seems like we do. How can we sit by and say, well, I'm not a German, so I can't criticize the Nazis or something, right? I mean, that's just what they do. I'm not part of their in-group. No, aren't there just some universals that when they get violated, we have the obligation to say are wrong because they violate those universals? And so the fact that it doesn't allow us to critique outgroups is a problem. Another problem with ethical relativism is that morality seems to be decided by the in-group, the majority. So if I'm Christian and I think that Christianity calls us to pacifism, but the vast majority of Christians say that that's not true, well, then I just lose. And the Christian tradition adopts just war theory, and now as a Christian I have to adopt the morality of my group, right? Or if I'm an American citizen and I disagree with abortion, but I live in a country that says it's okay and there's nothing wrong with doing it, it's legal, then again, because the majority has spoken, I'm sort of left out of the cold, and that can be frustrating, right? Why should the majority of a given group decide? Don't the minority get hurt? And what if the minority are right? What if the minority have appealed to something morally true? This can be a problem. Moral progress is questioned because if everything's relative, we can't really make moral progress, right? You can make moral change over time. Women are not allowed to work. Now it's a good thing for women to work, or whatever. Slavery was okay. Now we say it's wrong. And morality has changed. But if you're a relativist, you can't say it's progressed, because progress means we're heading to some objective end. We're moving closer to our goal, which is moral truth. But if there is no objective moral truth, then you can't move closer to it. You just have change, but no progress. But wouldn't we argue the fact that we have less slavery in the world now than ever before, wouldn't we say that's moral progress, not just moral change? But if it's progress, it means we're moving towards something objective or universal. Or the fact that less people will die today because of their ethnicity, or that less people will die today because of their religious beliefs than maybe any other day in history, wouldn't we say that's moral progress, not just moral change? So the ethical relativism runs into some problems here. The last critique is that it seems to be self-contradictory. I want you to think about this for a second, right? Ethical relativism argues that we cannot judge outgroups. We have to be tolerant and not interfere. So if another group does things we don't like, do things that violate human rights, do things that we find objectionable, hey, we're not them, they're not us, we can't hold them accountable to our standards. But at some point, aren't we making tolerance a universal? That we have to be tolerant of various groups and not interfere, even when they're not tolerant. So I've got to be tolerant of Hutus, even though they're not tolerant of Tutsis and they kill them, randomly almost, right? Well, if that's true, haven't I made tolerance something that is universal, that everyone has to follow? If so, then you have a contradiction on your hands, because you've created a moral universal. Everyone ought to be tolerant of other groups. If you don't, then you're essentially saying it's okay when one group is intolerant and starts to kill or enslave another group. So you're forced into a moral contradiction. You have to either say genocide and forced slavery and things are okay. If they're not, because of tolerance, then you've made tolerance a universal, and you believe that there's at least one universal, and you're no longer a relativist. So there can be some issues here with the contradictory nature of ethical relativism. So you want to keep those criticisms in mind. So Rachel's advocates a soft universal view, right? This view says that there are some basic moral universal truths that cut through time, culture, religion. They are universal. However, outside of these few universal truths, we will rely on ethical relativism. So a few universals, maybe a handful, right? Maybe 10. Outside of those universals, we allow groups to determine morality for themselves. But maybe tolerance is a moral universal. When we see the Nazis being intolerant of the Jews, we need to step in. They've violated a universal. Or when Hutus become intolerant of Tutsis, they've violated a universal, right? So now maybe we can resolve some of these issues with soft universalism. And Rachel's mentions a few in his writings. He says taking care of children is a universal. Every culture does this. People object, saying, well, what about, like in certain Eskimo tribes, they kill their own children at times. They participate in infanticide. What do we say about that? And Rachel says, while on the surface it looks like when Eskimos kill their children, they're violating the sense of taking care of their children, obviously killing and taking care of them seem incompatible. He says, but they're actually following the same principle. The reason that Eskimos kill some of their children is when times get really tough because they're living in very difficult conditions, it's hard to find food. If there's not enough food to feed the whole family, then someone's going to have to die as a result of this severe lack of resources regarding food. Best to kill the young. We don't have attachments to the young. They're the most vulnerable, the least likely to feel pain. And so if we have to make a choice between which children will have the new ones be killed. Now, they don't want to kill their kids. The idea is that it's to preserve the family as a whole. So basically doing this is a tragedy that allows us to feed our remaining children. So the principle of taking care of your children is upheld. That's a universal thing. Unfortunately, in some extreme circumstances, taking care of and loving your children requires you to kill others, right? He mentions lying, that every culture operates by the assumption that you should tell the truth. Lying requires a justification, like if you lied to save a life, that might be okay. If you lied to protect a family member, that might be okay. But the idea is that the vast majority of the time, the moral thing to do is to tell the truth, to trust one another, to follow through with contracts and promises, and that every culture is built on this in some ways. He mentions murder, which means do not kill innocents. And that this is something that you see in every culture. Yes, you might see one group killing another group, but it's usually when they've decided that that group is not innocent for some reason. They might be totally mistaken. But the principle they're trying to follow is don't kill the innocent, right? Because that's murder. And he mentions several of these, and then this is the logic, and I think this is key. I want you to pay attention here. This is James Rachel's, right? There are some moral rules that all societies must have in common because those rules are necessary for society to exist. In order to survive, we have to function in groups. If you're an isolated individual with no help gathering resources or procreating or surviving the increments, the weather, animals, and whatnot, you will die. We survived in our past, and even now, through cooperation and working in groups and in relationships, in churches and communities and countries. We need one another to survive. But groups can only function, cooperation can only flourish, when you make certain rules like, I will not kill you unjustly if you will not kill me unjustly. I will not steal your things if you do not steal my things. I will not lie to you if you do not lie to me. Right? And because we have these rules, it allows groups to survive and to flourish. And this is why we see these same basic principles in almost every culture. Because without them, we would not make it. Right? So there are certain moral universals that James Rachels believes we've tapped into. And as a result, we should adhere to them and judge groups that violate them. Something that I want to mention, right? Ethical relativism predominantly is the notion that human beings construct morality. We create it. If there are universals, the primary view is that we don't create moral universals, we discover them. We discover them in the very nature of things, the very nature of the universe. The way we didn't create gold, we discovered gold. We didn't create oil, we discovered oil. It's the difference between objective truth and subjective truth. We created it so we can continue to change it, versus we discovered it and we don't get a say in changing it. So it's a big difference in morality between relativism and universals. The big question for soft universalists is what can ground universal truths, right? How do we know that these things are universal? How do we know that we didn't just create them? What tells us that these principles are universal? And if we turn to religion, even religious people disagree with one another. Even Christians disagree. How do we know which Christians are right and which are wrong? How do we overcome relativism, right? That if I lived in a different culture, if I was raised 1,000 years ago, I would think differently about morality. That just seems true. How do we overcome that to say, oh, but now we see clearly and know what the universals are? And this is the big objection, right? And the big hurdle for soft universalism. It's something I would want you to think about seriously in terms of your own moral life. Well, I hope this helps. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. And I'll look forward to seeing you guys online.